So, why am I being so hard on Peter this morning? What did he do that was so wrong? Wasn't he following the lead of the Holy Spirit? Wasn't he being bold, taking a stand for Jesus? Yes. Yes, to all of that. Yes. But as I read this story, though, it's not that Peter was wrong. I felt that he just wasn't right enough. He missed this golden opportunity to embrace, to unite, to bind together those who are all working for God. And I know you can't insert yourself into history. You don't know the time and the place and the context and all the subtle nuances of the reality of that moment. I get all that. But I also get that human beings are so good at setting limits on God's love. We tell ourselves that we're the ones that are qualified to say who's in or who's out, who's included, who's excluded, who's holy, and who's going to hell. We sometimes open our daily devotion not expecting to be surprised by God, but hoping to find a word that emboldens our preconceived notions and our assumptions, our convictions based less on the gospel and more on politics, culture, life. This morning in the Acts of the Apostles, there is a line that shakes up our world. Peter says, there is salvation in no one else, that is, no other one than Jesus, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. The word must in Greek, prepe, is usually pronounced or translated ought. It can also be translated shall. It's used in the New Testament some 100 times. Most of the time it's translated ought, but here it's must, absolute. And I wonder, a religious leader visited a small church out in the country. Some children were picked to ask questions. And the first one was a 5-year-old boy. And the little boy approached the steps to ask this religious leader a question, and he froze. He just kept looking at the minister. And all the children were encouraging him, and then the little boy just started to cry. And the adults tried to assure him, but he just stood there and cried. And the minister said, "Come whisper your question in my ear." So the little boy went up the steps, and the minister embraced the boy with absolute love. And for the longest time, they just sat there, and the boy cried, and the minister cried, and they just sat there together. And then the little boy started to whisper in his ear, and then the minister whispered back in the little boy's ear, and they sat there for a little while longer. And then the little boy smiled and said goodbye and went back to his little seat. This boy's father had died. He said that his dad was a good man, but his mom said that dad was not a believer, so the little boy was worried. His dad brought all his kids to be baptized in the church, but he wasn't baptized himself, and now he is dead. And the little boy was crying because he was worried. Could his dad, a non-believer, go to heaven? How wonderful to hear a son say that his dad was a good man, said the minister. We have to remember that only God decides who goes to heaven. We have to remember that God has the heart of a father. Children, do you think that God was happy when his dad had his children baptized? Wasn't that a good thing? And all the children shouted, yes! Do you think that God is happy with us when we do good things? And all the children shouted, yes! Do you think that God, who has a heart of love, could possibly be able to leave this boy's father far from himself? The children shouted, no, no. You see, there is your answer. God, who loves with a dad's heart, could not possibly leave your dad far away from himself. By the next day, the headlines on the internet were, "The Pope faces backlash for telling child atheists go to heaven." Is that what he said? No. what he taught was that it's up to God what happens to us, living, dead, before, after, during, in between. It's up to God. It's all up to God. Thank God it's up to God and not us. It's up to God. The critics of the Pope said, "See, unless you confess that Jesus is Lord and believe the Christian faith, you cannot be saved. Peter said so." Is that what God said? The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is a source of salvation for the whole world. Jesus is a revelation of who God is and how God saves. That's what Peter proclaims in chapter 4 of Acts. But if you keep reading, you know what happens next? God surprises people by letting more and more and more know about God's love. At first, Jesus' followers believed that if you wanted to follow Jesus, you had to first become a Jew. And they started going through all these things. We love to dictate how people gain access to God, and typically we're the only ones who hold the keys. But God surprised those early Christians. The rest of the book of Acts, more and more people experience God's love. Men, women, boys, girls, slaves, servants, rich, poor, foreigners, people who were Jewish, people who were not Jewish. It seems that once God unleashes this saving love in the world, it spreads in ways that we can't control, despite our very best efforts to do so. I'm the good shepherd. I love my flock. I give everything for my sheep. I lay down my life for them. I know mine and they know me. And then Jesus says, I also have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. There will be one flock, one shepherd. There's Jesus telling his earliest followers, I've got other sheep. Maybe they didn't know who those other sheep were. And maybe we don't either. And maybe they didn't know by what method those other sheep were going to be shepherded. And maybe we don't either. But you'll notice God's love is the same. God will find a way to shepherd them and include them in God's heart of love. In the first letter of John, we just read it a couple of weeks ago, it says that God is greater than our hearts. So I'm not entirely sure it's our job to try to explain how God's gift of Jesus is going to be experienced by anybody else. We can have a confessional theology. That is, I don't know about all that. All I know is God is greater than our hearts. All I know is that God came to me through the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I don't know how it's going to happen for anybody else, because God's love is bigger than my limitations. And the times I want to build barriers or judge somebody is beyond God's ability to love them, I probably need to remember I have other sheep not yet in the fold. I will shepherd them. Sometimes we just have to let God be God. So whatever's worrying you or whatever's on your heart, if something is making you cry, or whatever argument you think you need to have with somebody else, or whatever stance of defiance you need to make, try whispering it in God's ears and let God do what God does.